Okay, we have a packed schedule, so let's get started. First of all, let me welcome you to this session organized by the Ethics and Government Affairs Committees of the Society. A couple of little ground rules first, please. One, please turn off your cell phones or put them on ringer or whatever you do. At the end of the session, please go ahead and submit your evaluation of the session. It's done through the app. There's no paper evaluation. Well, let me give you a little background for why we're here and what we're trying to do. First of all, this sort of marks the 21st birthday of the Society's meetings, and I figure that that's equivalent to becoming an adult as a society, and I think that you all are aware that that the field has in fact achieved some adulthood now with real clinical successes. And with those successes come some difficulties and problems. The background of this field at the moment is that the FDA and other organizations have now recognized that the therapies are real, and the question now is for the society members who work so hard at making the technology real, how to get this new knowledge and new therapies to real people with real disease. We all know that that there have been problems in general with the pricing of medications, pricing of drugs, and you've seen political and scientific and technical discussions of that at a rapidly increasing pace. And we all know that drug prices are sometimes a major problem and put the cost of therapy out of reach of many patients. The same is true of these genetic-based therapies, these rather remarkable new approaches to disease management, to rare diseases and common diseases. And the experience that we've had with the approval by the FDA and other agencies of gene therapies sort of mimics and exacerbates the problems of drug costs. Things are very expensive. And the question, of course, is how to ensure that we get treatments to people who need it and to make all these major new advances accessible. There have been some attempts to analyze that and understand the forces and the logistics of how drug prices are set. And this is an illustration from MIT Technology Journal, which indicates the cost of these therapies in the horizontal lines as a function of the availability of candidate patients or available patients. And you can see that the poster child of this problem, Glybera, costed at more than $1 million, and for that's for an extremely small number of patients, maybe one patient or more, not many more. And then the costs that continue to hover around somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million for Luxturna, from Spark, from Strimvelis, and Kymriah. It's daunting for many people to understand, of course, how these prices are established and whether they are, in fact, the kind of prices that make the therapies real and available to people. You work very hard at developing the technology. You don't want to see it disappear in a puff of smoke and become inaccessible to real people. So why are prices so high for these gene-based therapies? And we've heard a number of potential rationales that the therapy is driven by the high cost of research and development. This is a very expensive business, and manufacturers are entitled to some degree of profit. We've heard explanations that the costs are compatible with industry pricing standards in other areas of therapeutics, drug treatments, for instance, for cystic fibrosis, and therefore the high cost is justified, as described by a Biogen spokesman some time ago. We've also heard explanations that they're high, but people ought to be and will be willing to pay very high prices for the treatment of life-threatening and devastating disease. And finally, the list price is not a hindrance because companies and manufacturers will develop or are developing financial aid programs for patients whose costs are not covered by insurance, maybe. So how do we solve this problem, if we all agree it's a problem? We've heard a number of real-world and not so real-world potential solutions. One is, of course, to use providers such as Medicare in the U.S. To negotiate prices with manufacturers to bring those prices down if possible. That's done in most of the rest of the world, but not in the U.S. It's in fact specifically disallowed in the U.S. The suggestion of advertising drug costs so that the free market will work and people will vote with their feet, that's recently been raised by the Trump administration as a potential way of reducing costs. And they've also suggested that another way of reducing costs in this country, or reducing the disparity of costs in this country, is to force higher prices elsewhere, so the disparity will disappear. Well, we've seen the political approach to the problem, and you've all heard pronouncements, and we see it every other day in the newspapers about programs to lower drug prices. So we thought we'd bring together a group of people who are in the middle of this issue, and what we've done is to organize a set of 5 short talks from people who've played a role in dealing with this problem, and then at the end we'll have a little roundtable discussion for questions and answers from the public. Why did that happen? So let me just briefly tell you who the speakers will be. We're going to start with Wendy White, who's the chairman of the board of Global Genes, a patient advocacy group for rare diseases. We're going to follow that with sorry, I've had computer problems. Right. Eric Auger, who's a partner of Putnam Associates, and that's a group that has been involved in establishing standards for commercialization and for pricing of gene-based therapies. Maria Graziella Roncarolo will follow that. She's at Stanford now after a long time in Milan, and has been interested in developing therapies for rare diseases, including ADA-SCID. Jason Meyerborg will come next, and he's now the Chief Commercial Officer of Orchard Therapeutics in the UK. And then we'll end with Carl June, who at University of Pennsylvania, who of course has been developing some of the most exciting CAR T and immunotherapy approaches to cancer. So each speaker will speak about 15, 17 minutes or so, And we can have one urgent question after each speaker, but then save the major questions and comments and arguments for the roundtable, for the panel that we'll have at the end. So let me start and ask Wendy White to come and start the discussion. Wendy will tell us what patients need and why they are or not getting it.
So do current pricing strategies assure fair access to the values of gene-based therapies? That's what we're here to talk about. I'm a rare disease caregiver, and I'm also the chair of Global Genes, which is a global rare disease patient advocacy organization. And I'm actually going to speak from the rare disease perspective. Since 80% of rare diseases are genetic, I think there's a strong crossover. Plus, we have a history of dealing with high-priced therapies. So first, just to level set, a little bit about the rare disease landscape. We know that the rare disease space is a large and complex and heterogeneous pool, that the space is, has a prevalence and severity that varies greatly, that of the 7,000 different rare diseases that are currently known, doctors only know about 500 of them in their regular repertoire. 80% are genetic, and 50% are children. So when I talk about patients, I'm really saying patients and caregivers. And what that means, we're at Global Genes, we know that it's 1 in 10 people worldwide. That's 30 million people in the US and 30 million people in Europe. It's 350 million people we're talking about if you looked at the whole group worldwide. In fact, if all the people with rare diseases lived in one country, it would be the world's 3rd largest country, most populous country. And it's important to know the landscape because this means that patients and caregivers are not getting served by their healthcare providers, as you can see, because it's too difficult, and they're very active and engaged. And that can work for you or that can work against you, depending on how you engage with them. Patients have the most to lose if innovation is stifled, and that's one of the main concerns that we have. Patients have a huge stake in this issue. In the U.S., we're fine with companies making a reasonable profit. We know that that encourages innovation. We're also okay if you bring a drug to market for an orphan indication and then add on other indications, as long as you continue to support the original community and obviously that you're, have some rationale for your pricing. We want the price systems we want ones that are more transparent and defensible. We know that rare diseases are characterized by high complexity, that there are small patient populations that have to be factored into whatever the price is when you go to market. We know that that can limit the speed of clinical trial enrollment, and we know that there's a limited availability of clinical experts, and that all those things together reasonably drive the costs up. In fact, but the biggest issue for us is that less than 5% of those 7,000 diseases have approved therapies. So 95% don't have one single FDA-approved therapy. So we are absolutely in the game with you to help drive innovation. And very excited to see all of you here doing amazing, amazing work. And here's the other thing we know. We know that the Orphan Drug Act worked. That before, almost 30 years ago, there were very, very few orphan drugs, and now there are over almost 450, or maybe a little bit more, drugs approved in the U.S. and about 130 in Europe. So that shows that that's a good legislation. And what we're concerned about is if we don't actually step in to the pricing debate, the wrong levers may be targeted for lower pricing. For example, in the U.S., we had one of the recommendations that didn't go through, thank goodness, but was to eliminate the orphan drug tax credit. And we're not for that because we need a lot more drugs. The other thing we need is access. All the work that we're doing is just amazing. But here's what patients want to know. They want to know, how fast can I get it? Where do I get it? And can I afford it? That's the biggest issue for patients, sustainable access. The vast majority of people living right now with a rare disease have delayed or no access at all to the medication they need, or there's no existing medication. Even if a medicine is approved, if the patient doesn't have insurance, they may not get access. 50% of patients who have a rare disease are in medical bankruptcy. These are genetic, it's generational. So that means that they may not have insurance. So one of the arguments that you sometimes hear is, well, it would be more expensive if there weren't a therapy over time, like for example with Hep C. But imagine if you live in Louisiana, which is a very poor state here in the US, you have Hep C, and you know there's a cure out there, but you're relying on Medicaid, but the Medicaid budget can't afford to give everybody who has Hep C a cure. The problem is that it's not cheaper, because if you don't have insurance and you're really sick and poor, you'll die probably sooner, and that's actually cheaper. So we have to think about that. I think we have to step in and think about what do we think? What do we think? Do we think about healthcare? And the other thing is, if a therapy is approved, but it doesn't reach those who need it, it's failed in its primary purpose. So that's why access is so important. So the other thing that we see, at least in the US and probably all over the world, is the systems are coming under increased financial pressure. That's because of aging populations, which put more burden on everyone, not just the patients, but their whole families. There are inefficiencies in the healthcare systems that were really designed when there was less technology, and also we were more prosperous. There's an increasing cost of the development of innovative medication, all the way from bench to the marketing approval. Today estimated at an astonishing $2.6 billion. That includes the failed candidates. According to Tufts, only 12% of drug candidates entering trial are approved for use. And we also know that in rare diseases that the patient to launch time for orphan drugs is 2.3 years longer. And drug pricing is seen as a populist issue. Only 13% of patients thought pharma companies effectively explain pricing policies. 80% of Americans think prescription drug prices are unreasonably high. Over 50% think lowering drug prices should be our government's top policy priority. And 72% think the pharma industry has too much influence in Washington. And by the way, that's higher than the Wall Street and the National Rifle Association. Yeah. And industry's kind of in a tough spot to defend itself. Several companies have been called out for spiking prices on older and marginally innovative products, like Martin Shkreli did not do us any favors. Sometimes new indications don't lower the price. So an example of that might be Gleevec from Gist, which is a life-saving medicine. And I mean, people died before that medicine came on board. They brought that medicine on, and now it's gone through a number of other indications so that it's really a blockbuster if you put it all together. But the price has really not dropped as much as you would think it should. Sometimes old medicines get bought and remarketed with greatly increased prices. We have an example here in Chicago where Marathon brought deflazacort to market, which is a steroid that's DMD patients like a little bit more than prednisone, which prednisone's what, 4 cents or something? And the Marathon drug was $80,000. That's a lot. It's hard, I mean, whatever the arguments are, you have to put that in the context of what people think that aren't in this industry. Generics don't always get lower prices. I don't know if any of you guys saw the news from a month or two ago about Wilson's disease. The price went, this is from a patient's perspective, in 2010 the price was about $652 for 100 pills, and then Valiant brought a branded version of that to market, and it went up to $21,000 for 100 pills of the branded version, and then the patients got all excited because Teva was going to come with a generic version, and the generic version came to market for $18,000 for 100 pills. Which is cheaper by $3,000, but from a patient's perspective, it's still a lot more expensive for the same medication. There's a recent 60 Minutes interview that was unflattering, And as we heard, our president's giving a speech on this, and whatever the outcome of that is, the fact is our president's giving a speech about this. So one of the things pharma has done is they've responded with the Goal Boldly campaign. But it's fantastic. It's great that we're getting our message out there. We're spending, $100 million on this, but it doesn't mention pricing. So I think that's a missed opportunity. So in the late 1980s, there was an intense focus on the effect of chemicals on the environment and human health. And that was catalyzed by the tragic industrial accident in Bhopal that killed more than 30,000 people. And what had been simmering came to a full boil. The industry needed an earnest, credible, and sustained response. And what they did is something called the Responsible Care Program, which provided a much-needed opportunity for the industry to explain its practices and chemistry's role and value in our daily lives directly to the communities in which chemical plants were located and end users and society. And at the heart of the program were community advisory panels composed of chemical plant personnel, local emergency responders, civic leaders, and citizens. Company representatives presented environmental and workplace safety plans to the panels. They reported on performance, and they explained what the chemicals were used for in the plant and to what purpose. And most of the major players participated in that program and had a significant positive impact on the industry's reputation as well as its marketing and policy environments. So the pharma industry faces this perceptual and political dynamic similar, I think, to what the chemical industry faced back then. And our response needs to lead with direct stakeholder engagement. And we need to be at least as aggressive as the chemical industry was, or we risk a shift that might appeal to a popular sentiment near term, but could set back innovation and drug development for a decade or longer. So I'm glad that this panel is part of this conference and we're looking at this. This is what we want as patients. Oh, sorry, got behind. We want, whoops, no, I need to go back. There we go. We want the industry to double down on direct community engagement. There are great examples of companies doing this now, but we want to figure out how to make it standard and expected. We want companies to include patients at every step of the way. I've actually just started as a chief patient officer at a company, and we don't even go into the clinic next year. So there's amazing examples of companies that are doing great work. We want companies to be transparent and fair about pricing, to redefine value from the patient's perspective. That means more around outcomes. We want them to share data, whether the trial is successful or not. There's a great example of Amicus Therapeutics, which bought a drug for epidermolysis bullosa and didn't have great results in their phase 3 trials, and they shared that data. In fact, they got on the phone with anyone who asked, including competitors, to walk through all their clinical data and explain what they were doing well and where they might have done better. That's the kind of thing that patients look at and say, that's real patient centricity. We want companies to share patient sense of urgency, to communicate regularly, even if there's nothing to share. In fact, you really have to do that, because if you don't communicate with patients who are, remember, very engaged, then they're going to make up stories about why you're not communicating. So you should talk to them, even if you just say, we have nothing to share right now, but we're still working for you. And we also hope that you think about how you're going to address the entire population, including plans for Medicaid, Medicare patients, and uninsured patients. All right, now I'll skip ahead. So at Global Genes, what we're doing is we are going to look at this. We're really interested in this problem because we think it's vital. So we're doing a multi-stakeholder summit on October 5th in 2018 in Irvine, California. And our plan is to develop something kind of like what the chemical industry did, a rare pack, to build a better model by which we can characterize and assess the value of therapies with patients' needs, experiences, and outcomes at the center. And we want to look at things that are not just about extending the life. We want to look at, of course, the volume, but also things like lost productivity, having and caring for children and grandchildren, improvements in caregiver health and well-being, which is actually a huge issue. Insurance value meaning that Even though you might not personally have a rare disease, the effects are so devastating that and it's 1 in 10 people, that it's worth it for you to support a little bit in terms of the insurance, because you may get one in the future. The severity of the disease, the value of hope, equity, social justice, we're going to have to think through that. Scientific spillovers, like when we find things about rare diseases, that in fact it informs our knowledge of science and could in fact have other kinds of effects for the greater good, and the value of cure separate from just the payer budget decisions. And by the way, if your company's interested in participating, just see me after the panel. So this is the future of medicine, and it's exciting. It's an exciting time to be innovating. It's fantastic that you guys are here. I'm sure you're all pumped up from all the great things you're seeing. We just need to find new models and ways to think about value and pricing and access. Because if a therapy is approved but does not reach those who need it, it has failed in its primary purpose. And we want to figure it out together with all the stakeholders at the table and outcomes at the center. Thank you.